Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. On November 28, 1957, the Thanksgiving holiday would become synonymous with something far more sinister than gratitude in one particular house on Ocean Avenue in Amityville, Long Island. What began as a simple family gathering would evolve into one of the most meticulously documented cases of psychological breakdown and domestic terror ever recorded in Suffolk County archives. The events that unfolded over those 4 days would challenge everything the local authorities thought they understood about human behavior under extreme stress, and would ultimately force the medical community to confront questions about consciousness itself that remain unanswered to this day. The house itself stood unremarkable among its neighbors. A 2-story colonial built in 1928 by contractor William Morgenstern, whose construction company had erected nearly 40 similar homes throughout the Amityville area during the building boom that followed the Great War. Located at number 112 Ocean Avenue, it featured the standard architectural elements of its era. White clapboard siding that required repainting every 3 years, black shutters that had weathered to a deep charcoal gray, and a wraparound porch that faced the street with 4 substantial columns supporting its roof. Property records held at the Suffolk County Clerk's office indicate the house changed hands 3 times between its construction and 1956, when it was purchased by Harold and Margaret Whitmore for the sum of $14,500, financed through a 15-year mortgage with Amityville Savings and Loan. Harold Whitmore worked as a regional supervisor for the Long Island Railroad, a position he had held for nearly 12 years by the time of the Thanksgiving incident. His responsibilities included overseeing track maintenance and safety inspections along a 40-mile stretch of the Babylon Branch Line, work that required him to travel extensively throughout Nassau and Suffolk counties. Margaret, his wife of 16 years, managed the household and maintained extensive correspondence with her family scattered across New England, particularly her 3 sisters who had remained in Connecticut after their parents' deaths in the influenza epidemic of 1942. Neighbors described the couple as quiet, methodical people who kept to themselves but were always polite when encountered during their daily routines around the neighborhood or at Morrison's Market on Merrick Road, where they conducted their weekly shopping every Saturday morning at precisely 9:30. Mrs. Catherine Bellows, who lived directly across Ocean Avenue in a nearly identical colonial that her late husband had purchased in 1931, would later tell investigators that she had never once heard raised voices from the Whitmore residents during the 18 months they had been neighbors, not even during the summer months when windows remained open and conversations from neighboring houses could clearly be heard across the tree-lined street. Mrs. Bellows, a widow of 7 years who spent considerable time observing the comings and goings of her neighbors, maintained detailed mental notes about the routines of everyone on her block, a habit she had developed during the war years when suspicious activity was considered a matter of national security. The couple's routine rarely deviated from its established pattern, according to multiple sources interviewed during the subsequent investigation. Harold caught the 7:15 train from the Amityville station every weekday morning, walking the 8 blocks from Ocean Avenue with a leather briefcase that contained his work orders, safety reports, and the thermos of coffee that Margaret prepared fresh each morning before dawn. He returned on the 6:02 evening service, arriving home by 6:30 to find dinner waiting on the kitchen table. Margaret spent her mornings tending to household duties that included maintaining detailed records of household expenses in a small blue notebook, darning Harold's work socks, and preparing meals that reflected her Connecticut upbringing with an emphasis on simple, substantial fare. Her afternoons were dedicated to reading novels borrowed from the Amityville Public Library and working in the small garden behind the house, where she cultivated tomatoes, green beans, and a variety of herbs that she used for cooking, and occasionally shared with Mrs. Bellows when their conversations extended beyond polite greetings. On Saturdays, they shopped together at Morrison's Market, where owner Samuel Morrison would later tell police that the Whitmores never varied their routine of arriving at 9:30, purchasing the same basic items week after week, and paying with exact change that Margaret counted from a small purse she carried specifically for this purpose. Harold typically selected a newspaper from the rack near the register while Margaret completed their purchases, and their entire visit rarely lasted longer than 20 minutes. Sundays were reserved for Methodist services at the church on Broadway, where they occupied the same pew in the fourth row on the right side of the nave, followed by quiet evenings at home where Harold read technical manuals related to railroad safety, while Margaret worked on needlepoint projects that she mailed to her sisters as Christmas and birthday gifts. This predictable existence had continued uninterrupted for the entire year preceding the November incident, with only minor variations such as Harold's occasional weekend trips to inspect damaged track sections or Margaret's monthly visits to the beauty parlor on Main Street, where she maintained the same simple hairstyle she had worn since her wedding day. The stability of their routine was so well established that Mrs. Bellows could predict their activities with remarkable accuracy, often setting her own schedule around the predictable sounds of their daily movements. Harold's footsteps on the front porch at 6:30 each evening, the sound of Margaret hanging laundry on Tuesday and Friday mornings, and the distinctive click of their front door lock being engaged each night at exactly 10:15. The first indication that something had begun to change came in late October, according to postal worker Edmund Caruthers, who had delivered mail to Ocean Avenue for 8 years and prided himself on knowing the correspondence patterns of every household on his route. He noticed that the Whitmores had begun receiving an unusual volume of packages, particularly items wrapped in brown paper that arrived without return addresses and bore postmarks from cities throughout the northeastern United States. When questioned during the subsequent investigation, Caruthers estimated that these mysterious deliveries had increased from perhaps 1 per month to 3 or 4 per week during the month leading up to Thanksgiving, with packages arriving on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays with remarkable consistency. The packages themselves appeared to be roughly the same size, approximately 8 inches square, and weighing what Caruthers estimated to be 2 or 3 pounds each. They were always wrapped in plain brown paper with addresses written in block letters using black ink, and they bore no identifying marks other than the postmarks that indicated origins in Hartford, New Haven, Providence, and several smaller New England towns. Caruthers noted that Margaret always accepted these deliveries personally, appearing at the door within moments of his knock, as though she had been watching for his arrival. Her demeanor during these exchanges had gradually changed from her usual polite but reserved manner to something approaching eagerness, though she never offered any explanation for the increased correspondence. Margaret's sister, Dorothy Hazelton, had planned to join them for the holiday meal, traveling from her home in Hartford, Connecticut, where she worked as a seamstress in a dress factory and lived alone in a modest apartment above a bakery on Farmington Avenue. This arrangement had been discussed in letters between the sisters throughout October, with Margaret expressing what Dorothy would later describe as unusual enthusiasm for the gathering, and an insistence on preparing elaborate holiday meals that went far beyond their typical simple fare. In her statement to investigators, Dorothy recalled that Margaret's correspondence during this period contained references to special preparations and ensuring everything would be perfect for our reunion, phrases that seemed uncharacteristic of her sister's usually practical approach to holiday celebrations. Dorothy also mentioned that Margaret's letters had begun including detailed questions about their childhood, particularly asking her to recall specific events from their time growing up in their parents' house on Elm Street in Hartford. These inquiries seemed odd to Dorothy because the events Margaret asked about were mundane details from decades past: the pattern of wallpaper in their childhood bedroom, the sound their father's footsteps made on the wooden stairs, the way sunlight fell through the kitchen window during winter afternoons. At the time, Dorothy assumed these questions reflected Margaret's natural nostalgia as she prepared for their first holiday gathering in several years, but she would later wonder if something more significant had prompted her sister's sudden preoccupation with forgotten details. The Tuesday before Thanksgiving. November 26th marked the last confirmed normal interaction between the Whitmores and the outside world. Mrs. Bellows observed Margaret hanging laundry in the backyard during the late afternoon, noting that she seemed to be moving more slowly than usual, and paused frequently to stare at the ground near her feet. Harold was seen returning from work at his usual time, but Mrs. Bellows noticed that he walked directly to his front door without his customary wave of acknowledgment, a small breach of routine that she found mildly troubling. The house appeared dark by 9 o'clock that evening, which aligned with the couple's typical schedule, but Mrs. Bellows would later recall that she had not heard the usual sound of their front door being locked at 10:15. Samuel Morrison at the market would report that the Whitmores had not appeared for their Saturday shopping trip on November 23rd, marking the first time in over a year that they had deviated from this routine without explanation. When questioned about this absence, Morrison stated that he had assumed they were making alternative arrangements for Thanksgiving shopping, perhaps visiting one of the larger markets in Babylon or Bayshore. However, he noted that Margaret had specifically asked him the previous week whether he would be open on the Saturday after Thanksgiving, a question that seemed to assume they would maintain their normal schedule throughout the holiday weekend. Dr. James Fitzgerald, the Methodist minister who had served the Broadway Church for 6 years and knew the Whitmores as reliable congregants, reported that they had been absent from services on November 24th, the Sunday before Thanksgiving. This absence was particularly notable because Margaret had volunteered 3 weeks earlier to help prepare decorations for the church's Thanksgiving service, a commitment she had never failed to honor in the past. Dr. Fitzgerald had expected to see her at the church on Saturday afternoon to assist with the preparation work, and when she failed to appear, he had considered telephoning, but decided against intruding on their holiday preparations. Dorothy Hazelton arrived at the Amityville train station on the afternoon of November 28th, carrying a small suitcase containing clothes for a 4-day visit and a paper bag with carefully wrapped gifts she had purchased for Harold and Margaret, a fountain pen set for Harold, and a book of poetry for Margaret, along with a bottle of maple syrup that she had brought from Vermont during a recent trip to visit their cousin, Ruth. She had expected to be met by Harold or Margaret as previously arranged in their correspondence, but when no one appeared after an hour of waiting in the small station building, she hired a taxi driven by Thomas Kowalski, a local man who supplemented his income from dock work with occasional taxi services for train passengers and tourists. During the short journey from the station to Ocean Avenue, Dorothy expressed mild concern about her sister's reliability, but showed no signs of genuine alarm, according to Kowalski's later testimony. She mentioned that Margaret had been particularly enthusiastic about the visit in her recent letters, which made her absence from the station somewhat puzzling, but Dorothy assumed that some minor domestic emergency or scheduling confusion had prevented her from making the trip to meet the train. She paid the taxi fare and approached the front door carrying her belongings and feeling slightly annoyed, but not yet worried about her sister's apparent forgetfulness. Her first knock on the front door received no response, though she could see that lights were burning in several windows of the house. Dorothy waited several minutes before knocking again, this time more forcefully, and calling out her sister's name. When she tried the front door handle, she discovered it was unlocked, which she would later describe as highly unusual, Since Margaret typically kept the house secure during daylight hours and had frequently commented on the importance of maintaining proper security practices, especially when Harold was away at work. The unlocked door struck Dorothy as sufficiently out of character that she hesitated before entering, but her concern for her sister's well-being overcame her reservations about entering uninvited. Calling out her sister's name as she stepped into the front hallway, Dorothy received no answer from within the apparently empty house. The interior appeared normal at first glance, with the living room furniture remaining in its proper arrangement and no signs of disturbance immediately visible. The familiar scent of Margaret's cooking lingered in the air, suggesting that meal preparation had been underway recently, and Dorothy could see that the dining room table had been set with 3 place settings using the good china that Margaret reserved for special occasions. Everything suggested that preparations for their Thanksgiving reunion had been proceeding as planned, but the absence of her hosts created an atmosphere of vague unease that Dorothy found difficult to define. She set down her belongings near the front door and walked through the first floor systematically, calling for Margaret and Harold in each room. The kitchen showed extensive evidence of meal preparation. Several large pots sat on the stove with their contents still warm. Vegetables had been cleaned and arranged on the counter in neat piles according to their intended use. And a large turkey sat in a roasting pan, partially prepared but not yet placed in the oven. The preparation work appeared to have been interrupted suddenly, with a paring knife lying beside half-peeled potatoes and a bowl of cranberries sitting unwashed beside the sink. A cookbook lay open on the counter to a recipe for stuffing, with handwritten notes in Margaret's careful script indicating modifications she had planned to make. The dining room table had been set with obvious care, featuring the Whitmore's wedding china, silver utensils that had been polished to a bright shine, and 3 crystal glasses arranged precisely at each place setting. A centerpiece of autumn leaves and small gourds had been arranged in a ceramic bowl that Dorothy recognized as having belonged to their mother, and cloth napkins had been folded into neat triangles beside each plate. The scene suggested that Margaret had devoted considerable time and attention to creating an elegant holiday presentation, which made her current absence even more puzzling and concerning. Dorothy climbed the stairs to the second floor, where she found the bedroom doors standing open, but no occupants present in any of the rooms. The master bedroom appeared undisturbed, with the bed neatly made using the white chenille bedspread that Dorothy remembered Margaret purchasing during a shopping trip to New York City 3 years earlier. Harold's work clothes hung in the closet in their usual orderly arrangement, and his shaving implements remained in their accustomed places on the bathroom shelf. Margaret's personal items remained in their usual places on the vanity table: her hairbrush, a small jewelry box containing her wedding ring and a few simple pieces, and a photograph of their wedding day that had occupied the same spot for as long as Dorothy could remember. The bathroom showed no signs of recent use, with fresh towels hanging unused on their appointed hooks, and no evidence of the morning preparations that would normally have been completed by this time of day. The guest bedroom, where Dorothy had stayed during previous visits, had been prepared for her arrival, with clean sheets on the bed and a small vase of flowers on the nightstand, indicating that Margaret had been expecting her sister's visit and had taken time to prepare for her comfort. This careful preparation made the current situation even more bewildering, suggesting that whatever had happened had occurred after Margaret had completed her preparations for Dorothy's arrival. Growing increasingly concerned about her sister's whereabouts, Dorothy returned to the first floor and discovered what she had missed during her initial inspection of the house. The basement door, located off the kitchen near the pantry, stood slightly ajar with darkness visible beyond the partially opened entry. She would later tell investigators that something about that darkness beyond the door filled her with an inexplicable sense of dread that seemed disproportionate to the simple fact of an open basement door. The feeling was so strong that she found herself reluctant to investigate further, despite her growing concern about Margaret and Harold's location. Rather than descend into the basement alone, Dorothy decided to contact the authorities, a decision that would later prove to be crucial to the subsequent investigation. She used the telephone in the kitchen to call the Suffolk County Police, reaching the dispatch operator at 4:27 in the afternoon, according to official records. During this call, she explained that she had arrived for a planned visit to find her sister and brother-in-law missing from their home, with evidence of meal preparation abandoned in mid-process, and the house left unlocked and unattended. Officer Benjamin Lawson responded to the scene within 30 minutes, accompanied by his partner, Officer Robert Chen, both experienced patrolmen who had been with the Suffolk County Police for over 5 years and had responded to numerous domestic emergencies throughout the Amityville area. Their initial assessment confirmed Dorothy's observations. The house appeared to be in perfect order except for the absence of its occupants and the interrupted meal preparation in the kitchen. The abandoned holiday preparations suggested that the Whitmores had been present earlier that day and had been engaged in normal domestic activities. But no evidence indicated where they might have gone or why they would abandon their holiday preparations when expecting a guest. Officer Lawson attempted to contact Harold's workplace, but was informed that the railroad offices were closed for the holiday and no supervisory personnel were available until the following Monday. A canvass of immediate neighbors yielded limited useful information, though several residents confirmed that they had seen lights in the Whitmore house during the previous evening and had noticed no unusual activity or disturbances. Mrs. Bellows stated that she had observed Harold returning from work at his usual time on Tuesday evening, but could not recall any specific details about activity at the house during the current day. Other residents of Ocean Avenue reported nothing unusual, though Mrs. Eleanor Costco, who lived 3 houses down from the Whitmores, mentioned that she thought she had heard what sounded like voices coming from the direction of their house during the early morning hours, possibly around 5 or 6 o'clock. However, she could not be certain of the time or even whether the voices had actually come from the Whitmore residence rather than from someone walking past on the sidewalk. Mrs. Costco also noted that she had not seen either Harold or Margaret outside their house during the day, which was somewhat unusual since Margaret typically spent time in her garden during pleasant weather. The basement investigation would prove to be the turning point in the case and would introduce elements that challenged conventional understanding of human behavior under stress. Officer Chen descended the wooden stairs with his flashlight after determining that the basement's electrical system was not functioning, though the reason for the power failure could not be immediately determined. The basement appeared to be typical of houses from that construction period: concrete foundation walls, wooden floor joists supporting the first floor, and minimal finishing that included a concrete floor painted gray and exposed beams overhead. What Officer Chen discovered in the basement's main room defied easy explanation and would remain etched in his memory for the remainder of his career in law enforcement. Harold and Margaret Whitmore sat facing each other across a small wooden table in the center of the room, positioned as though they had been engaged in conversation or perhaps sharing a meal. Though no food or dishes were visible on the table surface, their eyes remained open but completely unresponsive to external stimuli, staring straight ahead with an intensity that seemed to penetrate the darkness of the unlit basement. Neither showed any reaction to Officer Chen's presence, his voice when he called their names, or the beam of his flashlight directed toward their faces. The positioning of the couple appeared deliberate rather than accidental, with their chairs placed at precise distances from the table and their hands resting on the table surface in symmetrical arrangements. Harold's hands lay flat with his palms down and fingers spread slightly, while Margaret's hands were folded with her fingers interlaced, creating an almost ritualistic appearance that struck Officer Chen as deeply unsettling. Their clothing appeared neat and undisturbed, with no signs of struggle or physical distress, but their complete lack of response to external stimulation suggested a psychological condition far beyond normal sleep or unconsciousness. Officer Chen immediately called for backup and emergency medical assistance, though he remained in the basement with the unresponsive couple while waiting for additional personnel to arrive. During this period, he attempted various methods of eliciting a response, speaking their names in increasingly loud tones, clapping his hands near their faces, and even gently touching Harold's shoulder. None of these efforts produced any reaction whatsoever, and the couple maintained their fixed staring positions without any acknowledgement of the officer's presence or actions. Emergency medical personnel arrived within 20 minutes of Officer Chen's discovery, led by Dr. James Morrison, who served as the emergency physician for the Amityville area and had over 15 years of experience treating various medical emergencies. Dr. Morrison's initial examination found both individuals in stable physical condition with normal vital signs, including regular pulse rates, normal blood pressure readings, and steady respiratory patterns. However, they exhibited complete absence of response to all forms of external stimulation, including bright lights directed at their eyes, loud sounds, and physical contact. Dr. Morrison noted in his initial report that the couple appeared to have been sitting in their basement positions for an extended period, possibly several hours, based on the rigidity of their posture and the slightly cool temperature of their skin. Their eyes remained open throughout his examination, but the pupils did not react to changes in light intensity, and no reflexive blinking occurred when objects were moved close to their faces. The doctor's attempts to elicit verbal responses through direct questions and simple commands proved completely unsuccessful, with neither patient showing any indication that they could hear or understand spoken words. The most disturbing aspect of the scene, according to multiple witnesses present during the basement examination, was the complete silence that permeated the space in a way that seemed to extend beyond normal acoustic properties. Officer Chen would later describe it as an absence of sound so complete that it seemed to absorb even the noise of their own movements and voices, creating an oppressive atmosphere that made normal conversation difficult and added to the overall sense of unease that pervaded the investigation. Dr. Morrison noted in his report that his medical equipment, which typically produced audible clicks and beeps during operation, seemed muffled to the point of near inaudibility while he conducted his examination in the basement. This acoustic phenomenon could not be immediately explained by the room's construction or contents, and it contributed to the growing sense among the responding personnel that they were dealing with circumstances that defied conventional explanation. Harold and Margaret Whitmore were carefully transported to Southside Hospital in Bay Shore, where they were placed under psychiatric observation in a specialized unit equipped to monitor patients with severe psychological disorders. The transport itself presented unusual challenges, as the couple had to be physically lifted from their chairs and carried to the ambulance while maintaining their rigid posturing, almost as though their bodies had become fixed in the positions they had occupied in the basement. During the initial 17 days of hospitalization, neither patient spoke, moved voluntarily, or showed any acknowledgement of their surroundings, medical personnel, or changing conditions. They accepted food and water when provided through careful manual feeding, but exhibited no voluntary behavior such as reaching for items, turning their heads toward sounds, or responding to their names. Hospital staff noted that the patients seemed to exist in a state of suspended animation, maintaining basic physiological functions while showing no evidence of conscious awareness or psychological responsiveness. Dr. Eleanor Fitzhugh, the attending psychiatrist who specialized in severe dissociative disorders and had treated similar cases throughout her career, documented their condition as a form of dissociative stupor of unknown origin. In her detailed medical notes, she described the complete absence of voluntary movement, speech, or response to external stimuli, combined with the maintenance of basic physiological functions such as breathing, circulation, and digestion. This combination of symptoms did not match any standard psychiatric classification and represented what Dr. Fitzhugh would later describe as the most severe case of dissociative disorder she had encountered in over 20 years of practice. The investigation of the Ocean Avenue house continued for 6 days following the couple's discovery, with Detective Lieutenant William Torino supervising a thorough examination of the property in search of any evidence that might explain the extraordinary behavior exhibited by the Whitmores. The basement received particular attention from investigators, who conducted extensive measurements and photographic documentation of the room where the couple had been found. However, despite careful examination of every surface, object, and structural element in the basement, investigators found nothing that could account for the couple's condition or their decision to position themselves at that specific location. One detail that emerged during the investigation concerned the basement's unusual acoustic properties, which had been noted by multiple officers and investigators during their examinations of the space. Several personnel reported that sound seemed strangely dampened in that area, with normal conversation becoming difficult and mechanical devices producing muffled or distorted audio output. This phenomenon persisted throughout the investigation period and could not be attributed to any obvious structural features or environmental conditions. Structural engineers called in to examine the basement's construction found nothing unusual about its design or materials. The concrete foundation walls, wooden floor joists, and basic electrical wiring all conform to standard construction practices for houses built during the 1920s. The acoustic dampening effect noted by investigators could not be explained by the room's dimensions, surfaces, or contents, leading to speculation about possible environmental factors that might not be immediately apparent. Dorothy Hazelton provided investigators with extensive background information about her sister's recent correspondence and behavior patterns, though nothing in Margaret's letters or reported activities suggested any indication of mental distress, family problems, or unusual circumstances that might have contributed to the psychological breakdown. The mysterious packages that postal worker Carruthers had mentioned could not be located anywhere in the house, and no evidence of their contents was discovered during the comprehensive search of the property. When questioned specifically about these deliveries, Dorothy stated that Margaret had never mentioned receiving any unusual mail or packages during their regular correspondence. This absence of information about the packages became a significant element in the investigation, as postal records confirmed Carruthers' account of multiple deliveries to the Whitmore address. But no trace of these items could be found, despite thorough searches of the house, garage, and surrounding grounds. The Long Island Railroad Company provided complete employment records for Harold Whitmore, confirming that he had maintained perfect attendance through November 27th and had given no indication of personal problems, health concerns, or workplace difficulties to his supervisors or colleagues. His work performance had remained consistent with his previous standards throughout the months preceding the incident, and his supervisor, Frank Morrison, reported that Harold had seemed completely normal during their last interaction on Tuesday afternoon before the Thanksgiving holiday. Harold's colleagues described his behavior during his final days of work as entirely typical of his usual professional demeanor, punctual, methodical, and focused on his safety inspection responsibilities. Railroad conductor James Sullivan, who had worked with Harold for over 8 years, stated that Harold had expressed normal holiday sentiments when they parted company on Tuesday evening, mentioning his plans for Thanksgiving dinner with his wife's sister, and indicating that he looked forward to the brief break from his regular schedule. On December 15th, after 17 days of complete unresponsiveness, Harold Whitmore suddenly regained consciousness and normal behavior while sitting in the hospital's common room, during the afternoon recreational period. Nurses reported that he simply began speaking in the middle of what appeared to be a conversation he was having with an invisible companion, then looked around the room with apparent confusion about his location and circumstances. Within hours, he demonstrated complete awareness of his surroundings and normal cognitive function, but claimed to have no memory of the events leading up to his hospitalization or any recollection of the time period following his last clear memory of Tuesday evening, November 26th. Hospital staff documented Harold's recovery as sudden and complete, with no gradual progression from his unresponsive state to normal consciousness. Dr. Fitzhugh noted that his transition appeared to occur instantaneously, as though a switch had been activated to restore his normal mental functioning. Medical examinations conducted immediately after his recovery revealed no neurological abnormalities, brain damage, or other physical indicators that might explain his previous condition or the mechanism of his sudden improvement. Margaret's recovery occurred 2 days later under remarkably similar circumstances. She awakened in her hospital bed during the early morning hours and immediately asked a nurse what time dinner would be served, as though she had been temporarily napping rather than catatonic for nearly 3 weeks. Like her husband, she demonstrated immediate return to normal cognitive function, but retained no memory of the Thanksgiving incident, the period of unresponsiveness, or any events following her last clear recollection of Tuesday evening activities in her kitchen. Extensive medical examinations conducted after both recoveries revealed no physical abnormalities, neurological damage, or biochemical indicators of the severe psychological condition they had experienced. Blood tests, neurological assessments, and psychological evaluations all returned normal results, suggesting that whatever had caused their dissociative episodes had left no detectable physical or mental aftereffects. Dr. Fitzhugh noted in her final report that the couple's amnesia appeared to be complete and genuine, extending to several hours before their discovered condition in the basement, but not affecting their long-term memories or basic cognitive abilities. The medical team's inability to identify any underlying cause for the couple's condition or to explain the mechanism of their sudden recovery presented significant challenges to conventional psychiatric understanding. Dr. Fitzhugh consulted with colleagues throughout the New York metropolitan area and reviewed extensive medical literature, but found no documented cases that paralleled the specific combination of symptoms and recovery pattern exhibited by the Whitmores. Harold and Margaret returned to their Ocean Avenue home on December 20th, but their adjustment to normal life proved more difficult than medical personnel had anticipated. Neighbors reported that the couple appeared nervous and frequently looked toward their basement door, even when conducting normal household activities on the first floor. Mrs. Bellows observed that they began keeping all of their window curtains drawn during daylight hours, a practice they had never followed previously, and that their usual routine of evening walks around the neighborhood had been discontinued entirely. The couple's shopping trips to Morrison's Market became irregular and hurried, with Margaret appearing anxious to complete their purchases and leave the store as quickly as possible. Samuel Morrison noted that they no longer engaged in the brief social conversations that had previously characterized their weekly visits, and that Margaret seemed particularly uncomfortable when other customers attempted to ask about their recent absence from the neighborhood. Dr. Fitzgerald at the Methodist Church reported that the Whitmores attended services sporadically following their return home, abandoning their previous pattern of regular weekly attendance. When they did appear, they sat in the back row rather than their customary fourth-row seats, and they left immediately following the closing hymn rather than participating in the social interactions that typically occurred after services. On January 8, 1958, the Whitmores listed their house for sale with a local real estate agent and moved to a rental apartment in Babylon, New York, approximately 15 miles east of Amityville. Harold arranged a transfer to a different position with the railroad company that required no travel to his former workplace or interaction with colleagues who had known him before the incident. When questioned by a reporter from the Long Island Press about their decision to relocate, Margaret stated simply that they had decided to seek a fresh start in the new year, declining to provide any additional details about their recent experiences or future plans. The Ocean Avenue house remained empty for 11 months after the Whitmores' departure, despite being priced below market value and receiving attention from several potential buyers who toured the property with real estate agents. However, none of these prospective purchasers completed a transaction, with most citing vague concerns about the house's atmosphere or feeling, without being able to specify their objections in concrete terms. Mrs. Bellows would later tell a reporter from the Amityville Record that she observed lights in the basement windows of the empty house on multiple occasions during this period, though the electricity had been disconnected since February 19, 1958, according to utility company records. These apparent illumination sightings occurred primarily during evening hours and were described as dim, yellowish glows that seemed to move slowly through the basement space before disappearing entirely. Other neighbors reported similar observations of unexplained lights in the vacant house, though no evidence of unauthorized entry or vandalism was ever discovered during periodic inspections by the real estate agent and local police. The basement door remained locked throughout this period, and no signs of disturbance were found in the rooms where the lights had allegedly been seen. Thomas Henderson, a mechanical engineer from Levittown who specialized in industrial heating systems, purchased the house in November 1958 for $11,000, considerably below its assessed value of $15,000. Henderson lived alone following his divorce 3 years earlier and spent most of his time traveling throughout Long Island and New Jersey for work assignments, using the Ocean Avenue address primarily as a weekend residence and storage location for his technical equipment and personal belongings. Henderson's occupancy of the house appeared normal during the initial months, with neighbors noting that he maintained the property adequately and caused no disturbances to the surrounding area. He installed additional lighting in the basement area to create a workshop space for his engineering projects, and he made minor repairs to the house's exterior that had been neglected during its vacant period. On June 14, 1959, Henderson was discovered by his employer's representative in a condition remarkably similar to that experienced by the Whitmores 18 months earlier. The representative, William Clark from Johnson Engineering Company, had come to check on Henderson after he failed to report for a scheduled work assignment in Hempstead and could not be reached by telephone at either his office or home numbers. Clark found the front door unlocked and Henderson absent from the main floor of the house, though evidence suggested he had been present recently. Fresh coffee remained in a pot on the kitchen stove, and technical drawings were spread across a table in the living room, as though he had been working on a project earlier that morning. Following the same pattern as Dorothy Hazelton's discovery of the Whitmores, Clark eventually located Henderson in the basement, sitting motionless at the same table where the previous occupants had been found. Henderson's condition appeared identical to that documented in the Whitmore case. Complete unresponsiveness to external stimuli, fixed staring position, and rigid posture that suggested he had been sitting in that location for several hours. Clark immediately contacted police and emergency medical personnel, and Henderson was transported to Southside Hospital under the care of Dr. Morrison and Dr. Fitzhugh, who had maintained their positions at the facility since the previous incident. Henderson's recovery occurred after 6 days of hospitalization, following the same pattern of sudden, complete restoration of consciousness that had characterized the Whitmore's experience. Like his predecessors, he retained no memory of the events leading up to his unresponsive condition or any awareness of the time period he had spent in the basement. Medical examinations revealed no physical or neurological abnormalities that could explain his temporary condition. Following Henderson's incident, the Suffolk County Health Department conducted a comprehensive environmental investigation of the property under the direction of Dr. Margaret Steinberg, the county's chief environmental health officer. The investigation team included specialists in air quality, water contamination, electrical systems, and structural safety, all working to identify any hazardous conditions that might contribute to the psychological effects experienced by the house's occupants. Inspectors tested extensively for gas leaks that might cause oxygen deprivation or chemical poisoning, carbon monoxide accumulation that could result from faulty heating systems or poor ventilation, electrical problems that might create electromagnetic fields or other environmental hazards, and possible contamination of the water supply from industrial chemicals or natural toxins. All testing results came back within normal ranges for residential properties, and no hazardous conditions were identified anywhere in the house or on the surrounding grounds. The basement's unusual acoustic properties were noted and measured during this investigation, but acoustical engineers determined that while the sound dampening effect was real and measurable, it fell within normal ranges for basement spaces and posed no health risks to occupants. The phenomenon was attributed to the combination of concrete surfaces, wooden ceiling structures, and the room's dimensions, though the engineers acknowledged that the degree of sound absorption was somewhat greater than would typically be expected. Dr. Fitzhugh, who had now treated both the Whitmores and Henderson for nearly identical conditions, began conducting informal research into the Ocean Avenue incidents as part of her broader interest in environmental factors that might contribute to dissociative disorders. Her personal notes, discovered among her papers after her retirement in 1967, suggest that she suspected some form of environmental factor specific to the basement space might be responsible for the psychological effects experienced by the house's susceptible occupants. The house changed hands twice more between 1959 and 1962, but both subsequent owners reported no unusual experiences during their periods of residence. Dr. Fitzhugh's notes indicate that she interviewed these later residents extensively and found that the Morrison family, who occupied the house from late 1959 through 1961, and the Chen family, who lived there during 1962, used the basement only for storage and laundry purposes, spending minimal time in the area where the previous incidents had occurred. Both families reported that they found the basement space somewhat uncomfortable and preferred to complete necessary tasks there quickly rather than lingering in the area, but neither experienced any psychological symptoms or unusual effects from their limited exposure to the environment. Dr. Fitzhugh noted that this pattern suggested the phenomenon might require extended exposure or specific psychological predisposition to manifest, though she was unable to identify the precise factors that determined susceptibility. In 1963, the basement underwent extensive renovation under the direction of the property's new owner, contractor Michael Kowalski, who had purchased the house as an investment property and intended to update it for resale to a more affluent clientele. The renovation included installation of additional electrical lighting throughout the basement, improved ventilation systems to address moisture concerns, and finished wall paneling that covered the original concrete surfaces and created a more residential appearance. According to Dr. Fitzhugh's records, this renovation appeared to eliminate whatever factor had contributed to the previous psychological incidents, as no further unusual behavior was reported by any subsequent occupants of the house. The acoustic properties of the basement were altered by the addition of the wall paneling and improved ventilation, and the overall atmosphere of the space became more typical of finished basement areas in comparable residential properties. The final entry in Dr. Fitzhugh's research notes, dated December 1964, contains her conclusion that the Ocean Avenue incidents were most likely caused by a combination of environmental factors specific to the basement's original construction and psychological susceptibility on the part of certain individuals who spent extended periods in that environment. She theorized that subtle variations in air pressure, humidity, temperature regulation, or acoustic properties might have created conditions that could trigger dissociative episodes in predisposed persons, though she acknowledged that her hypothesis could not be definitively proven given the elimination of the original environmental conditions. Dr. Fitzhugh's research also included interviews with family members and acquaintances of both the Whitmores and Henderson, seeking to identify common psychological characteristics that might have made them vulnerable to the environmental effects she suspected. However, these interviews revealed no significant commonalities in personality traits, medical history, family background, or life experiences that might explain their shared susceptibility to the basement's apparent psychological effects. Harold Whitmore died of natural causes related to heart disease in 1969 while living in a retirement community in Sarasota, Florida, where he and Margaret had relocated after Harold's retirement from the railroad company in 1966. Margaret survived until 1973, when she passed away in the same nursing facility where she had resided for her final 2 years due to complications from diabetes and circulatory problems related to her advanced age. Neither Harold nor Margaret ever returned to Long Island or spoke publicly about their experience on Ocean Avenue. According to family members and friends who maintained contact with them during their retirement years, their nephew, Robert Hazelton, Dorothy's son, stated in a brief interview that his aunt and uncle had seemed to deliberately avoid any discussion of their time in Amityville, changing the subject whenever their former home or the circumstances of their departure were mentioned. Thomas Henderson continued his engineering career until his retirement in 1971, maintaining his residence in Levittown and working on increasingly complex industrial projects throughout the New York metropolitan area. In a brief interview conducted by local historian Patricia Morrison in 1974, Henderson stated that he retained no memory of his time in the Ocean Avenue house beyond the day he moved in and the day he awakened in Southside Hospital, describing the missing months as simply a blank period in his life that he preferred not to contemplate or attempt to reconstruct. Henderson expressed no curiosity about the specific circumstances of his psychological episode or interest in learning more about the other incidents that had occurred in the same location. When asked whether he had experienced any lasting effects from his condition, he stated that his memory and cognitive function had returned to completely normal levels immediately following his recovery, and that he had suffered no subsequent psychological problems that might be related to his temporary condition. The Ocean Avenue house continued to be occupied by various families throughout the 1960s and 70s without any reported incidents or unusual experiences. The basement renovation appears to have permanently resolved whatever environmental conditions contributed to the earlier psychological episodes, and subsequent owners have used the space for typical residential purposes such as recreation areas, workshops, and storage without any adverse effects. Current residents, the Patterson family, who have occupied the house since 1991, report a completely normal home environment with no unusual characteristics or phenomena. James Patterson, a high school mathematics teacher, and his wife Sarah, a librarian at the Amityville Public Library, have raised 3 children in the house and describe it as a comfortable, peaceful family residence with no history of problems or concerns. The Pattersons were initially unaware of the house's unusual history when they purchased it, learning about the 1950s incidents only several years after moving in when Sarah encountered references to the case while researching local history for a library project. When questioned about their reaction to this information, both expressed mild interest but no concern, noting that their own experience in the house had been entirely positive and that whatever factors had contributed to the earlier incidents appeared to have been permanently resolved. Dr. Fitzhugh's research notes were donated to the Suffolk County Historical Society in 1978 by her estate following her death at age 79. The documents remain archived in the Society's research collection, but are not available for public examination due to privacy concerns related to the medical information they contain. However, local historians familiar with the case have confirmed that her work represents the most comprehensive documentation of the Ocean Avenue incidents and provides the most credible theoretical framework for understanding the environmental factors that may have contributed to the psychological episodes. The official police reports from the original incidents were sealed in 1965 under a county directive regarding privacy protection for medical records related to mental health cases. Access to these documents requires court authorization and demonstration of legitimate research or legal necessity, conditions that have rarely been met by individuals seeking information about the case. Mrs. Catherine Bellows continued to live across from the Ocean Avenue house until her death in 1976 at age 92, maintaining her position as the neighborhood's informal observer and historian throughout her final years. In her last interview with the Long Island Press, conducted on her 90th birthday in 1974, she maintained that something had been fundamentally different about the Whitmore house during the late 1950s, though she could never specify exactly what that difference had been or how she had been able to sense it. Mrs. Bellows described the period following the Whitmore incident as one of general unease among Ocean Avenue residents, with several families reporting vague feelings of discomfort when passing the empty house and children in the neighborhood showing reluctance to play in the vicinity. However, these concerns appeared to dissipate gradually after the house was renovated and reoccupied by families who experienced no unusual problems, suggesting that whatever atmospheric disturbance had affected the area was temporary and specific to the original environmental conditions.